Hello and welcome into this week's episode of the Everyday Strength Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Higley. As we move into the spring months and the weather starts to warm up for most of us across the country, this is usually where your training should start to shift a little bit. It doesn't need to be in a dramatic way where you throw everything out and you start over, but you just slightly change the emphasis. Fall and winter for me and my programming is where I like to spend a lot of time building strength, leaning into hypertrophy work, accumulating heavier volume, and pushing heavier loads. And then as the weather turns, this is a really natural point in the year to start layering in more of that conditioning work. We're still lifting, we're still trying to get strong, but now we're going to start to move more. We're going to start to breathe a little harder and actually build out that aerobic engine. There are a few reasons for that shift. And one is that it changes the stimulus, right? If you've spent months in the heavier, slower strength work, your body is ready for something a little bit different. And number two, it adds variety, but in a structured way. We're not just going to randomly start switching workouts, but instead we're shifting the focus with a purpose. And then three, probably the most practical for a lot of people, is it increases your total energy output. So if body composition is part of the long-term goal, which for most everyday athletes it is, then this is where that conditioning can actually help you reveal some of that muscle you've been working so hard all winter and fall to build. Now today I want to walk through 3 tools that I'm using when I'm building conditioning into a program like this. And that's sleds, carries, and erg-based work. And just to be clear, these aren't the only ways to condition. I still use kettlebell complexes and med balls and sandbags, dumbbells. All of that has a place. But what I want to do today is narrow the focus a little bit to be able to show you how to use these 3 specifically, because they tend to be some of the most repeatable and practical options for this time of year. When we can get outside, we can get some sunlight, we can carry kettlebells in the driveway, or we can drag a sled in a parking lot. And really, when you're thinking about this, right, as we go through this, it's pretty simple. It's not just what works, it's what gives me the best return for the least cost, right? How much adaptation am I getting from this? And what is it taking out of me to get it? Because the goal here isn't just to work hard. It's to start to be able to build conditioning in a way that actually supports your lifting, your recovery, and everything else that you've got going on in your life. So when it comes to sleds, okay, this is one of those tools that I think it gets more valuable the longer you train. One of the things that I say all the time is that the sled tends to give more than it takes. And the main reason for that is pretty straightforward. Right? We're working almost entirely concentrically. You're producing force, you're driving into the ground, but you're not absorbing a lot of force on the way back down like you would with jogging or sprinting or even certain lifting patterns. So what that means in practice is that you can now push hard, right? You can accumulate a lot of work and a lot of volume, and you're not going to get that same level of soreness or structural fatigue as you would from a lot of other conditioning methods. You can usually come back the next day and still be able to lift well. You can layer this into a program without it disrupting everything else. And in a lot of cases, right, sled drags are one of those movements that actually help you in both directions, right? They build the muscles that you need for squatting and deadlifting, and at the same time, they can help those tissues recover better by driving blood flow into those areas. And that's a big deal, especially for the type of athletes that I'm usually working with. We're not just trying to be good at conditioning, but we're trying to be strong and lean and capable across the board. And so the tools that you choose have to respect that. Now, within sled work, a really simple way to think about it is separating sled pushes and things like sled drags. Okay, they look similar on the surface, but they address, different components of training, right? They stress the body in a little different manner, and they give you different options depending on, what you're trying to do. Now, sled pushes tend to be a little bit more aggressive, right? You've got more forward lean, more quad involvement, and it's easier to turn those into a shorter, higher output effort. These are great when you want something that makes you feel a little bit more athletic, right? When you're driving into the ground and you're producing the force, right? You can keep them lighter and go more continuous to work on developing aerobic capacity, or you can load them up a bit and keep that distance shorter to work more in that glycolytic range or even into your ATP PC system. Both can work, it just depends on the intent. Now, sled drags, on the other hand, are usually a little smoother. Okay, here you're more upright. It's easier to find a rhythm with a sled drag, and they tend to be more forgiving, especially over longer durations. Backward drags, are something that I use a lot. They're great for building quad endurance. They're easy on the knees, and they're one of the simplest ways to now accumulate a lot of work without much downside. Okay, these were a staple at Westside Barbell, and they're a staple in my programming as well. Right? They allow you to build work capacity without bleeding into your recovery. So if you want a simple way to think about it, pushes are usually where I'll go for shorter, higher output efforts, and drags are where I'll spend more time on the longer, steady work. Now, a very simple aerobic session here could just look like 30 to 40 minutes where we're rotating between maybe like a light sled drag and walking. 60 to 90 seconds of dragging, 60 seconds of walking, and you just keep that going, throughout the entire duration. Nothing fancy, but it does add up quickly. And more importantly, you can recover from it well, and that's the key. Now, from there, the next piece is carries. And this is where things really start to look a lot like the strongman style of conditioning that I've talked about before. I talked about this in a previous episode, and a lot of those same ideas apply. At its core, that style of training is really just load, move, breathe, and repeat. And carries are one of the simplest ways to do that. They're a foundation piece. What I like about carries is that they don't isolate anything. Okay, you're not just working your legs or your lungs, you're stabilizing throughout the trunk. You're managing load, you're moving through space, and your breathing is being challenged the entire time. Okay, carries are very integrated demand, and that tends to transfer well to a lot of different goals. And similar to sleds, you can take carries in a lot of different directions. Depending on how you set them up, things like farmer's carries are usually a good starting point. 2 implements, even loading, and you can go relatively heavy if you want to with these. These are great for building grip strength, trunk stiffness, and just overall total body tension. You can keep them shorter and heavier, say 20 to 60 meter walks, or you can even lighten them up and stretch them out over longer distances and turn it into more of a steady conditioning piece. A traditional challenge here, and this is something that I like to program, is something like the kettlebell mile, right? Where you're walking roughly a quarter of your body weight in each hand for a mile as quickly as possible with as few set downs as possible. For a 200-pound male, that's usually somewhere between a 53-pound kettlebell in each hand. For females, maybe something closer to a 35-pound kettlebell. It's a simple benchmark workout, but a very honest one for practical strength and conditioning. And then you've got something like a suitcase carry, where now you offset the load to one side, just like you're carrying a heavy suitcase or a bag of groceries. The same basic idea, but now you're asking the trunk to resist that rotation and that lateral flexion, right? It changes the feel quite a bit, especially as you start to get fatigued. And it's a really nice way to add variety without changing the structure of the entire session. You can also make these more dynamic by hanging a kettlebell from a thick band and carrying it that way, hanging it by the band, right? That oscillation forces you to stabilize just a bit more, and it adds kind of another layer of control without needing to load more. There's other variations like front-loaded carries, whether that's a front rack position with kettlebells or a barbell or a zerker position, kind of in between the elbows. Again, these all shift things, and posture becomes more of a limiting factor with those variations. Right now, your upper back, your trunk, your breathing mechanics, all of that starts to come into play a little bit more with these variations. And these do tend to feel more globally fatiguing, even if the load isn't as high. And then we have things like overhead carries, whether that's one arm or both arms. they have their place in a program as well. We can change the load, lower loads, higher demand, especially on the shoulders and trunk. And then another variation that I use quite a bit, especially with athletes dealing with shoulder limitations, is a bottoms up carry, where you're holding a kettlebell upside down and you keep that arm kind of at a 90-degree angle in front of you. I think these require much lighter loads, but they certainly challenge the grip and the shoulder stability in a way that a lot of other movements don't. They're simple, they're very effective, especially when you're using them correctly. But the big idea with all of these isn't to memorize variations, but to understand that the carries in and of themselves are a way to blend strength and conditioning without now overcomplicating things, right? You can plug them into longer, easier sessions. You can pair them with your sled work, or you can use them in shorter, more demanding circuits. A simple example with carries might be 20 to 30 minutes where you're rotating through different carries and walking. Farmer carry for 40 meters, walk for a minute. Suitcase carry for 30 meters each side, walk again. And just repeat that. It's steady, it's controlled, and it builds more than you probably expect if you stick with it. Now, the third piece here is erg-based conditioning. And this is where things can start to become a little more precise, right? Sleds and carries are outstanding because they're practical. They're simple and functional, and they tend to be very forgiving from a recovery standpoint. But what they don't give you as easily is measurable output, right? That's where ergs come into play. And whenever I'm talking about ergs, I'm mainly talking about things like a bike erg or an echo bike, a rower, a ski erg. Those three different types of modalities can work here. They just have different feels and different use cases. Now, for me, personally, the Concept 2 bike erg is usually the starting point. It's very easy to control your pace. There's very little skill involved, and it's low impact. You're not dealing with a lot of eccentric stress, and that is something that makes it really easy to use for both longer aerobic work and for interval work. The bike erg is one of those tools that you can come back to again and again without it interfering with your lifting. Now, the Rogue Echo bike, or something like an assault bike, also works great, especially with more of that interval-based work. I hesitate to strongly recommend these air bikes for longer aerobic sessions simply because with the arm involvement and more unnatural resistance curve, I think it's a bit harder and more uncomfortable to maintain that for longer sessions, like a 45-minute or a 60-minute session. But for short sprints, full effort intervals, and more high intensity work, then an air bike is fantastic for that type of stuff. That doesn't mean that the C2 biker doesn't work for higher intensity work, or that an air bike doesn't work for aerobic capacity work, as they certainly do. These are just some of the limitations that come with those types of implements. Now, if you're in the market for a bike, I would strongly recommend the C2 biker over an air bike, just because I think it is a touch more versatile, right? But either one gets the job done. Now, the rower brings a bit more of a total body involvement. When it's done well, it's one of the best conditioning tools that you can use. Okay, you're getting leg drive. You're getting coordinated hip extension. Your upper back is heavily involved, and it's a really smooth cyclical pattern that allows you to generate a lot of power. It's great for both aerobic work and intervals, and it tends to feel a little bit more athletic than something like a bike once you get the rhythm down. But that said, it does require a little bit more awareness, right? If your technique slips with the rower, especially as you start to get fatigued, then it can shift that stress into the lower back, into the arms, or the wrong parts of the stroke. So it's one of those tools where a little bit of attention to pacing and mechanics goes a long way. When it's dialed in though, right, the rower is one of the best ways to build full body conditioning in a controlled manner. And then the ski erg is another tool that I like quite a bit. And in a lot of cases, I'll actually lean people toward the ski erg before the rower, especially early on. With the ski erg, it's a little easier to learn. It's a little less technical, and it still gives you a very strong upper body driven conditioning stimulus. Right, you're working through the lats, the trunk, the triceps, and the arms, and you can really settle into a rhythm with that without having to think as much about the sequencing. This is also a great option when your lower body is already fatigued from lifting or running, and you still want to get a quality conditioning workout. without adding more stress to those already fatigued body parts. And similar to the rower, you can use it for the steady aerobic work. You can use it for longer intervals or shorter, higher output efforts that really challenge the body. So between the bike, the rower, and the skier, you've got a lot of flexibility, depending on what you need and how you're feeling on a given day. But the big advantage with all of these is control, right? You can set a pace, you can hold a pace, and you can repeat that effort over time. That's what allows you to actually build conditioning instead of just feeling like you're working hard and breathing heavy. So when I'm programming ergs, I'm usually thinking in 3 buckets, not rigid categories, but general intent. So the first is aerobic work. This is your longer, steady efforts. You should be able to hold a conversation. Breathing is controlled, ideally nasal only, and the goal here is to just accumulate time. Okay, a simple way to do this, and something that I like quite a bit, is mixing modalities. You can take something like a 30-minute session and break it up into, say, 10 minutes on the bike, 10 minutes on the rower, and then 10 minutes on the ski erg. Do 1 round, do 2 rounds of that, and now you've knocked out 30 to 60 minutes of aerobic conditioning. The goal is to keep the effort steady, keep your heart rate low, and monitor your heart rate, your breathing, and your effort proxy to be able to prevent you from getting too glycolytic or too intense and then eating up into the purpose of that session. Now, what that type of work does is it spreads fatigue across different muscle groups. Mentally, it keeps things fresh and it allows you to go a little bit longer without one area becoming the limiting factor. The second bucket is that glycolytic or interval-based work. Okay, now we're starting to push the pace a bit more. A very simple structure here could be 5 to 6 rounds, 2 to 3 minutes at a hard but sustainable pace, followed by 2 easy minutes. And this is where we're working. Breathing is now elevated, but you're still in control. You're not sprinting. You're not falling apart. You're just holding a higher output for longer periods of time. And again, you can do this on one machine, or you can rotate between them if you want a little bit of variety. And then the third bucket is these short, high output intervals. This is where you might go 20 to 30 seconds all out, followed by 60 to 90 seconds or longer, depending, of easy recovery. You do that for 10 to 15 rounds. These are more about high output and repeatability than just fatigue. You want each effort to look similar, the same pace, the same intent, instead of one hard effort followed by a drastic drop-off. And the reason that this matters is because ergs give you something that's very hard to get elsewhere, right? They give you a way to progress. With ergs, you can track your pace, you can track your power, you can hold consistent outputs. And over time, you can actually see that improvement. That's what turns conditioning into something that you're building instead of just chasing fatigue session to session. Now, when you zoom out and we look at all 3 of these together, the sleds, the carries, the ergs, they each bring something a little bit different, right? Sleds give you that high output work with a very low recovery cost. Carries give you loaded movement, trunk involvement, and a very integrated demand. And then ergs give you control. They give you precision and the ability to actually measure and progress your conditioning. And when you combine them, you get a system that's varied, but not random. It's challenging, but recoverable. And it's structured without being overly complicated. Now, once you understand how these tools work on their own, then the next step is to combine them. This is where things can start to look like a mixed modality or strongman style conditioning session, where you're blending the implements, you're moving in different patterns, and the energy systems are all being trained within the same session. Right? These can be a really effective way to drive intensity and add variety and challenge your conditioning in a more dynamic way. But they also need to be used with some intent. These aren't things that you're doing every day. These are sessions that you plug in maybe once, maybe twice per week alongside your more controlled aerobic work and your strength training. Now, example 1 is a mixed modality strength conditioning session. Okay, this is a good example of blending strength elements, higher intensity work, and then finishing with a longer recovery-based piece. So let's start with an A block, right? A1 consists of a kettlebell complex, 5 rounds of, say, one clean into a squat, and then one clean into a thruster. Then we'll flow those together without putting the kettlebell down. And then without any rest, we're going to go directly into A2, which may look like an air bike sprint. 5 rounds of 60 seconds hard with about 2.5 minutes of rest before going back to the kettlebell complex. So here we've got a combination of that coordinated full body strength work followed by a hard cyclical effort. And then we'll move into a B block. So B1 could be a farmer's carry, 5 rounds of 100 feet, into B2, where we do a front rack kettlebell carry, 5 rounds of 100 feet, and then we'll rest about 2 minutes between rounds. Now we're shifting into a loaded movement with trunk stability, breathing under load. And then we'll finish with a longer recovery circuit. So we can do something that's simple like 5 rounds of 3 minutes on the air bike, 2 minutes on the ski erg, 1 minute on the jump rope. Keeping this as recovery and controlling our efforts. This should not feel like another high intensity piece. This is where you're bringing things down and you're accumulating volume and reinforcing that aerobic work, getting back into that restful sympathetic state. Example 2 is a continuous mixed modality circuit. This one is a bit more continuous and it flows through multiple modalities before we rest. So starting with an A block of air bike, 5 rounds of 20 calories, right into kettlebell cleans, 5 rounds of 10 reps, right into backward sled drag, 5 rounds of 200 feet, right into alternating kettlebell lateral lunges, 5 rounds of 10 per side, right into a Zerker carry, 5 rounds of 100 feet. And then we rest about 90 seconds. Now this is a more sustained effort where our fatigue is going to build a little bit across movements, right? Different muscle groups are going to become challenged and we're being forced to manage our pacing. But then we'll finish with a longer aerobic piece. So something like 20 minutes of continuous air bike, ski erg, jog, light sled push, different movements that we'll rotate through as needed with the intention of keeping the pace conversational. Again, this should be about bringing things back down, not burying ourselves. Now, a couple of important points with a session like this is that, first, these are very demanding. Okay, they're effective, but they come with a cost. So you don't need a lot of them throughout the week. 1 or 2 sessions like this, layered in with your strength training, layered in with your lower intensity aerobic work, is going to be more than enough. Second is that these should not replace your base work. It's really easy to default to a session like this because they feel more productive. You're sweating, you're moving, it feels like you're doing a lot of work, but the foundation is still your aerobic work. It's still your controlled intervals, your repeatable structure. These sessions are layered on top of that, not in place of it. That aerobic work is still essential, especially if you have those higher stress levels. If you're someone who works a demanding job, but during a conditioning phase of the year, like the spring months, adding in a mixed modality session like this is perfect for pushing your conditioning and adding in that variety. And then third is that progression still matters. Even with mixed sessions like this, you can improve your pacing. You can improve your transitions. You can increase load slightly or just execute the same session more cleanly. That's where the adaptation piece comes from. So when you look at the full picture here, right, you've got sleds for high output, low cost work. You've got carries for that integrated strength and conditioning work. And you've got ergs for more controlled, measurable efforts. And then we can combine them into these mixed modality sessions to tie everything together. And when we plug this back into the bigger picture, especially this time of year, this is where it fits extremely well, right? You're coming out of a strength and a hypertrophy phase. You don't need to abandon that work, but it might be a good idea to shift the emphasis a little bit, right? You can add in more movement. You can build your aerobic base, and you can improve your ability to handle more work. And from a body composition standpoint, you're increasing your total output without having to rely entirely on your diet to create that deficit and that change. And again, this isn't everything that you can do. It's just a very effective way to structure your conditioning without overcomplicating it. Sleds, carries, ergs, they give you a lot to work with if you use them with a little bit of intent. And you can build a high level of conditioning while still supporting your strength, your recovery, and your overall health and performance. Now, if you found this helpful, share it with someone who's looking to clean up their conditioning heading into the warmer months. And if you want to see how this is structured inside a full training program, that's exactly what we build into the Peak Performance System. I appreciate you guys listening, and we'll catch you in the next one. That's it for today's episode of the Everyday Strength Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, hit that subscribe button. Whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on Apple or Spotify, drop a comment on YouTube or leave a quick 5-star review on your podcast app. It helps the show reach more everyday athletes who train the right way. For weekly performance tools, training insights, and deeper breakdowns on strength, conditioning, physiology, and just becoming a better overall everyday athlete, join the free Performance Edge Network. You'll get the weekly newsletter with the topics I'm exploring, the experiments I'm running, and the practical takeaways that you can apply right away. And if you're ready to train with structure, check out my programs. Peak Performance is the flagship for building elite strength and conditioning. Peak 3X is the 3-day per week version for athletes who need maximum efficiency. And I've got programs centered around hybrid performance, running, and just becoming a stronger, more capable everyday athlete. You can find all of these programs at hagleystrength.com. I appreciate you listening. Keep showing up, keep working hard, and I'll see you in the next one.